Ethan Walker was 14 years old when he learned just how quickly the word family could lose its meaning. The house had never truly felt like home. It was a narrow, aging place on the edge of a small Midwestern town, with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged just enough to remind you it was tired. Still, for almost 2 years, it had been the closest thing to shelter after his parents died. Not warmth, not love, just shelter. That night, the air inside the house felt heavier than usual. The television murmured in the background, a game show no one was actually watching. The smell of reheated leftovers hung in the kitchen, sour and faintly burned. Ethan stood near the hallway, his backpack already zipped, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles had gone pale. His aunt didn't yell. That almost made it worse. "You can't stay here anymore," she said, arms crossed, her eyes fixed somewhere over his shoulder, as if looking directly at him would be too uncomfortable. "We've done what we could." Ethan swallowed hard. He had rehearsed his responses in his head 100 times. Promises to work harder, to stay out of the way, to be quieter, smaller, easier to ignore. But when the moment came, none of the words made it past his throat. "I'll sleep in the garage," he said finally, his voice cracking, thin and embarrassed. "Or the basement. I won't be any trouble." His uncle sighed, a tired, irritated sound adults make when they feel inconvenienced rather than cruel. "This isn't up for debate, Ethan. You're old enough to figure things out." Old enough. The words landed harder than the door that followed. 10 minutes later, Ethan stood on the front porch with his backpack slung over one shoulder, the strap digging into his collarbone. The porch light flicked off behind him without ceremony. The door closed. The lock clicked. Final. Absolute. The October night wrapped around him, sharp and cold. A thin wind scraped through the bare branches of the trees lining the street. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then went quiet. Ethan stayed where he was for a moment, staring at the door, half expecting it to open again. It didn't. He walked. At first, he didn't know where he was going. He followed the sidewalk out of habit, past houses glowing with warm yellow light, past curtains drawn tight against the cold. Each window felt like a small private world he no longer belonged to. Families eating dinner, someone laughing, someone else calling a kid to wash their hands. Ethan kept his head down. By the time he reached the edge of town, his legs ached and his chest felt hollow, like something important had been scooped out and left behind. He sat on a wooden bench near the closed feed store and shrugged his backpack off. Inside it were 3 shirts, 1 extra pair of jeans, a toothbrush, a folded photo of his parents that he never let anyone see, and a small wad of cash wrapped in a rubber band. $5. He counted it once, then again, as if the number might change if he stared hard enough. The town was quiet at night, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel louder than it should be. The hum of a distant highway, the creak of the bench beneath him, his own breathing, uneven and shaky. He thought about his parents then, not in the dramatic way people talked about grief, but in fragments. His dad's laugh, unrestrained. His mom's hands on his shoulders when she thought he wasn't listening. The way they used to say, "We'll figure it out." Even when things were bad, they'd always find a way. Ethan wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie and stood up. The next morning came, gray and unforgiving. Ethan slept curled up behind the feed store, using his backpack as a pillow, waking every hour to the cold seeping deeper into his bones. When the sun finally rose, it didn't bring warmth, just clarity. He couldn't stay like this. That's when he saw the paper taped crookedly to the bulletin board outside the courthouse. County auction, unclaimed property. Most people walked past it without slowing down. Ethan didn't. He stepped closer, squinting at the faded print. The list was short. Old farm equipment. Scrapland no one wanted. And near the bottom, almost as an afterthought, abandoned house, outskirts of town. Minimum bid $5. Ethan's heart thudded. The building sat miles outside town. Everyone knew that. A weather-beaten place people called the dead house or that old wreck. Kids dared each other to go near it in the summer. Adults talked about it like a bad memory they preferred to avoid. He'd heard the stories. Someone had frozen there years ago. The roof had collapsed. The place was cursed, useless. $5. Ethan looked down at the cash in his hand, then back at the paper. A strange calm settled over him, quiet and deliberate. He didn't feel brave. He didn't feel hopeful. He felt decided. The auction itself was small and awkward, held in a drafty room that smelled of dust and old wood. A few farmers leaned against the walls, hands in their pockets. The county clerk read the items in a bored voice. Bids came and went without much interest. When they got to the house, the room grew oddly still. $5, whom? The clerk asked. Do I have a bid? No one spoke. Ethan raised his hand. A couple of people chuckled, not unkindly, but with that soft disbelief reserved for kids who didn't know any better. $5, Ethan said louder this time. The clerk glanced at him, surprised, then shrugged. Any other bids? The hammer came down with a dull, final sound. Ethan signed his name with a borrowed pen, his handwriting uneven but determined. When he stepped outside, the deed folded carefully in his pocket. The sky was brighter than it had been for days. He didn't know how to fix a house, or how he'd survive the winter, but for the first time since the door had closed behind him, Ethan Walker owned something, and that was enough to take the next step. The walk to the house took most of the afternoon. Ethan followed a dirt road that narrowed into twin ruts, cutting through fields that were already turning brown with late fall. The town disappeared behind him faster than he expected, leaving him surrounded by wide, open land and a sky that seemed too big for a 14-year-old carrying his entire life on his back. With every step, doubt crept in. He replayed the laughter from the auction room, the way people had looked at him, not angry, not cruel, just amused, like watching a kid try to lift something far too heavy. Maybe they were right. By the time the house came into view, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the prairie. From a distance, the house barely looked like one at all, just a hunched shape against the land, like an old man who had finally given up standing straight. Up close, it was worse. The roof sagged in, a section completely collapsed. Weathered boards hung loose, rattling softly in the wind. The windows were empty holes, dark and hollow like missing teeth. The front door leaned crooked on one hinge, scraping against the frame when Ethan pushed it open. Cold air rushed out to meet him. The smell inside stopped him in his tracks. Damp wood, old dust, and something faintly sour, as though time itself had rotted here. The floor was uneven dirt and warped planks. Leaves had blown in and piled against the walls. A bird fluttered somewhere overhead, startled by his presence. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long moment, backpack still on his shoulders, his heart pounding. This was it. This was what $5 bought. He stepped inside. The wind whistled through the gaps in the walls, cutting straight through his hoodie. Light filtered down through holes in the roof, illuminating floating dust like tiny sparks. There was no furniture, no warmth, no comfort. But it was quiet. Not the empty quiet of abandonment, but the open kind, the kind that waited. Ethan walked around the small space slowly, counting steps without realizing it. The house was small, just one room, barely more than a box with a narrow back section that might have once been a sleeping area. He crouched and pressed his hand against one of the logs. The wood was rough and splintered, but solid beneath the surface. Not all of it was ruined. He sat down hard on a half-collapsed crate near the wall, letting out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. His chest ached. His hand shook. Whether from the cold or the fear, he couldn't tell. He pulled the folded deed from his pocket and smoothed it out on his knee. His name was on it. For the first time in his life, something official said he belonged somewhere. That night, Ethan slept inside the house. Not because it was warm, it wasn't, but because the thought of sleeping outside felt worse. He wedged the door shut as best he could with a broken plank, spread his jacket on the driest patch of ground he could find, and curled up with his backpack clutched to his chest. Every sound jolted him awake. The wind scraping against the wood, something scurrying in the walls, the distant howl of coyotes. Cold seeped into his bones until his teeth chattered uncontrollably. At one point, he sat up, hugging his knees, and whispered into the dark, "You can do this." He didn't fully believe it, but he said it anyway. Morning brought light, but not warmth. Frost coated the ground outside, turning the prairie silver. Ethan stepped out and stamped his feet, breathing fog into the air. His stomach growled painfully. $5 was gone. Food was already a problem. He returned to town that day, not to ask for help. He wasn't ready for that, but to look for work. He cleaned out a hardware shed for an elderly man, hauled boxes behind a diner, and earned a few dollars along with a lukewarm sandwich that he ate too quickly. People noticed him now, not dramatically, just small glances. Curious looks. Someone muttered, "That's the kid who bought the old place." By late afternoon, he stopped at the hardware store, more to warm up than anything else. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, and the smell of oil, wood, and metal wrapped around him. The man behind the counter looked up. Gray hair, broad shoulders, sharp but tired eyes. "You're the boy," he said, not unkindly. Ethan stiffened. "I guess the house," the man continued. $5 house. Ethan nodded, bracing himself. The man studied him for a long moment. "Name's Ray Collins," he said. "I run this place. You planning on fixing that wreck?" "Yes, sir." Ray snorted softly. "That house killed a man once." "So did the cold," Ethan replied before he could stop himself. His face flushed, but he didn't look away. "I won't let it do it again." Ray didn't smile, but something shifted in his expression. Not approval, exactly, but interest. "You got a plan?" Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "I've got time, and I can work." Ray leaned back, arms crossed. "Winter's coming early this year." "I know." Silence stretched between them before Ray sighed, reached under the counter, and pulled out a small box of bent nails and a roll of twine. He set them down. "Scrap. You can have it." Ethan stared at the materials, the first real help he'd gotten. He didn't know where to begin, but it didn't matter. He had the time, and now he had a plan. "I don't have any money," Ethan said. "Didn't ask for any," Ray replied. Ethan swallowed. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Ray said. "If you're still alive come spring, then we'll talk." Back at the house, Ethan got to work right away. He started small, clearing debris, dragging out rotten boards, sorting what could still be used. His hands blistered almost immediately. Dirt worked its way under his nails. He kept at it, pushing himself until his shoulders burned and his legs trembled. At sunset, he stepped back to survey what he'd done. It wasn't much, but the space felt different. Less like a grave, more like a beginning. That night, as the temperature dropped again, Ethan sat against the wall, wrapped in every layer of clothing he had. The wind still cut through the cracks. The roof still leaked starlight. But he wasn't leaving. Pressing his back to the rough wood, he closed his eyes and imagined what it could become. A roof that held, walls that blocked the wind, a place where the cold had to stay outside. For the first time since being kicked out, Ethan didn't feel invisible. He had a house, broken and forgotten, just like him. And somehow, that made all the difference. The cold came faster than Ethan expected. By the second week, mornings greeted him with stiff fingers and breath that puffed white, even inside. Frost crept along the interior walls, a quiet warning. Every night, the wind tested the house, slipping through the cracks, rattling the loose boards, reminding him how thin the line was between shelter and exposure. The house didn't welcome him. It challenged him. Ethan learned that quickly. One night, a gust tore loose a half-rotted board from the roof. It came down with a sharp crack, missing his head by inches. He sat on the dirt floor afterward, heart racing, staring at the gap above him where stars blinked coldly through the hole. If that had happened while he was asleep, he didn't finish the thought. The next morning, he made a decision. It felt heavy, but necessary. If the house was going to stand, he would have to tear parts of it apart first. Demolition wasn't dramatic like in the movies. It was slow, exhausting, and unforgiving. Ethan pried at the warped boards with a borrowed crowbar, climbing carefully along the weakened frame, testing each step before trusting it with his weight. Rotten wood crumbled in his hands. Nails bent rather than came free. More than once, he slipped and landed hard, knocking the breath from his lungs. No one saw that part. From the road, the house just looked worse. People started stopping again, pretending to check fences or survey fields. They watched from a distance, coats pulled tight, heads shaking. "He's tearing it down now," someone muttered one afternoon. "Told you. Won't make a month," another replied. Ethan heard them. He always did. He just didn't respond. His days fell into a brutal rhythm. Wake up cold. Work until his hands burned. Stop only when the light failed. Eat whatever he could afford, sometimes just bread and water. Sleep wrapped in his jacket, his body aching too much to care. The house pushed back constantly. A beam split unexpectedly. A nail tore his palm open, blood dark against the wood. One afternoon, exhaustion overtook him, and he sat down hard against the wall, his head dropping forward. For a moment, just a moment, he thought about leaving. The thought scared him more than the cold. He pressed his forehead against the rough log and breathed slowly until the feeling passed. Not quitting, he muttered to himself. The words were flat, stubborn. Not this. What Ethan didn't know was that the town had started talking differently. Not kinder, not yet, but quieter. Ray Collins drove out one afternoon under the excuse of delivering feed to a neighboring farm. He didn't stop at first, just slowed his truck, watching Ethan struggle to move a salvage beam into place alone. The kid moved with grim determination, jaw set, breath steady despite the strain. He didn't complain, didn't look around for help. Ray parked farther down the road and leaned against his truck, arms crossed. That roof should have collapsed already, he thought. Ethan scavenged constantly. He pulled usable boards from the collapsed section and stacked them carefully. He hauled stones from a dry creek bed a quarter of a mile away, one load at a time, to form a crude fire ring. When he found a stand of old cottonwood trees, downed years ago by a storm, he nearly laughed out loud. He cut what he could, splitting logs with an axe older than he was. The work tore blisters open, but they toughened his hands until they stopped bleeding. His movements grew more confident, more precise. At night, by lantern light, he planned, though not on paper. He didn't have any, but in his head. Which wall needed reinforcing first? Which gap let in the most wind? How to angle the boards so snow would slide instead of settle. The house slowly began to change. Not prettier, not more comfortable, but stronger. The first real snow came in early November. It was a wet, heavy fall that coated everything in white silence. Ethan stood outside, watching it for a long moment, fear tightening his chest. This was the test. Snow piled against the walls. Wind pressed against the structure. Inside, the temperature dropped quickly, but something held. The patched sections didn't collapse. The roof sagged but stayed in place. That night, Ethan sat near the fire ring, feeding it carefully, rationing warmth. He stared into the flames and felt something unfamiliar settle over him. Pride, not the loud, boastful kind, but the quiet, earned kind. He had survived that night. Then another and another. A week later, Ray returned, pulling up directly in front of the house. Ethan, chopping wood, looked up, startled. He wiped sweat and grime from his face with his sleeve, suddenly aware of how small he must seem, thin, dirty, wearing the same jacket he'd had for weeks. Ray stepped out of the truck, surveying the work in silence. You reinforced the west wall, he said after a moment. Ethan nodded. Wind hits hardest there. Ray raised an eyebrow. You teach yourself that. Just watched, Ethan replied, and guessed. Ray walked around the structure slowly, testing joints with his boot, checking the notches. He stopped near a corner where new wood met old. These cuts are tight, he said. Better than what was here before. Ethan waited, unsure if it was praise or a warning. Ray exhaled. My father was a carpenter. Tell me a few things. He glanced at Ethan. He'd have approved of this. The words hit harder than Ray probably intended. Ethan swallowed. Ray opened the back of his truck and pulled out a bundle wrapped in canvas. Got extra tar paper. Nails, too. Been sitting in storage. Ethan started to protest, but Ray interrupted, softer this time. Didn't say it was free. Ethan met his eyes. I'll pay you back. Ray nodded once. I believe you. As the truck pulled away, Ethan stood holding the bundle, chest tight with something that felt dangerously close to gratitude. That night, he worked by lantern light until his fingers went numb, laying tar paper, sealing gaps, doing everything he could before the next storm. The house wasn't warm, but it was fighting with him now, instead of against him. When Ethan finally lay down to sleep, the snow whispering against the roof, he stared up at the beams and allowed himself a thought he hadn't dared entertain before. Maybe this place wouldn't kill him. Maybe, just maybe, it was becoming his. December arrived without warning. It didn't ease in or announce its arrival. It came hard, fast, and unforgiving. One morning, Ethan woke to a silence so deep it felt wrong. No wind, no birds, just a heavy, oppressive quiet. He pushed open the door and stepped outside. Overnight, the world had disappeared beneath a thick blanket of snow. The prairie lay knee-deep in white, smooth and untouched except for the faint trace of the road in the distance. The sky hung low, a dull, gray mass threatening to collapse under its own weight. The cold hit immediately, sharp, biting, stealing the breath from his lungs. This wasn't the kind of cold you ignored. This was the kind that watched you. Ethan stood for a long moment, hands jammed into his pockets, feeling the fear creep in. Not panic, something quieter, more honest, the kind that asked hard questions. Could he make it through this? Inside, the house was dim and drafty, but it was different from weeks ago. The tar paper held. The patched walls groaned but didn't give. The roof sagged under the weight of snow but stayed put barely. Ethan fed the fire slowly, carefully, using what little wood he could spare. Every log was precious. Every mistake drained warmth. His routine tightened as winter closed in. Mornings began before dawn, when the cold was at its worst. He'd wake stiff and sore, breath fogging the air, his fingers slow to move. He forced circulation back into his hands, stamping his feet, stretching until the ache dulled. Then work. Not big projects anymore. Those had to wait. Winter work was about maintenance, reinforcing weak points, clearing snow from the roof before it piled too high, checking for new drafts, fixing small issues before they could become deadly. Some days, the wind howled so fiercely it felt like the house might tear itself apart. On those days, Ethan sat against the strongest wall, listening to the creaks and groans, learning the house's sounds the way sailors learn the sea. The house talked. You just had to listen. Food grew scarce. What little money Ethan earned from odd jobs barely stretched. He learned how hunger sharpened the senses, how it made smells richer and thoughts slower. He learned to ignore it when he had to. When he did go into town, people noticed, but not with laughter. They looked at him with disbelief. A few nodded. One woman slid an extra roll into his hand at the diner, not meeting his eyes. A farmer offered him a ride one evening, saying nothing the whole way. Ray Collins stopped by again, this time without pretending it was an accident. You're cutting it close, Ray said, scanning the roofline. Another heavy snow like this, you'll need more support. Ethan nodded. I know. Ray studied him for a moment. Ever think about quitting? Ethan didn't answer right away. He watched the wind push snow into drifts that rolled like waves across the field. Every day, he said finally, his voice quiet. But I don't have anywhere else to go. Ray's jaw tightened. That'll keep you going longer than hope ever will. December wore on, slow and relentless. Then came Christmas Eve. The storm rolled in just before sunset. Thick clouds swallowed the last slivers of light. Snow fell, heavy and wet, the kind that soaked through clothes and clung stubbornly to everything it touched. By nightfall, visibility dropped to almost nothing. Ethan worked frantically, clearing snow from the roof as fast as he could. His arms burned, his breath ragged. When his hands finally went numb, he climbed down and stumbled inside, slamming the door shut against the wind. He fed the fire, stripped off his soaked jacket, and wrapped himself in a blanket. The house held, but just outside the storm raged. The fire popped softly, casting flickering shadows along the walls. For the first time all day, Ethan allowed himself to sit still. He thought about the houses back in town, glowing warm and bright, about families gathered around tables, about things he didn't let himself want anymore. Then he saw it, the light. At first, he thought it was just his eyes playing tricks on him, snow reflecting the moonlight in strange ways. But then it moved, a flicker gone. Then again. Ethan stood slowly, heart pounding. He opened the door. The wind nearly ripped it from his hands. Through the swirling snow, shapes emerged. 3 figures bent against the storm. A woman clutching something to her chest. A child stumbling beside her. Another smaller shape barely moving at all. Hello. A man's voice called, thin and desperate. "Please, anyone." Ethan didn't think. He ran. The cold bit through his socks instantly as he crossed the short distance, grabbing the man's arm and steadying the woman as she nearly collapsed. "Inside," he said louder than he meant to. They stumbled into the house in a rush of snow and wind. Ethan slammed the door shut and leaned against it, chest heaving. The woman sank to the floor, shaking violently. The older child stood frozen, eyes wide, face pale. The smallest one, the one in her arms, was terrifyingly still. Ethan dropped to his knees. "How long?" he asked, his hands already moving. "Hours," the man said. "Our truck slid off the road. We couldn't see." He stopped crying. Ethan's stomach dropped. "Get it by the fire," he said. "Slow, not too close. Wrap him." The woman obeyed instantly. Ethan moved with a focus that surprised even him. He'd learned about cold the hard way. Nights spent shaking, fingers aching, toes numb. He knew what it could do if you let it win. He warmed water, used cloths, pressed heat where it mattered, spoke calmly and steadily. Even as fear clawed at his own chest. Minutes stretched, then longer. Finally, the smallest child let out a weak, broken cry. The sound hit Ethan like a punch. The woman sobbed openly. The man sank against the wall, his head in his hands. Ethan sat back on his heels, shaking now himself, not from the cold but from release. They stayed that night. There was no discussion, no question. Outside, the storm howled like it was angry at being denied. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, casting warm light over faces that had come frighteningly close to disappearing. Ethan watched the snow press against the windows and felt something shift deep inside him. This house, this broken, stubborn $5 house, had held, not just against winter, but against fate. And in doing so, it had quietly decided something important. This place wasn't just keeping him alive anymore. It was becoming a refuge. And nothing would ever make him walk away from it now. The storm broke sometime before dawn. Ethan woke to a strange, unfamiliar sound. Nothing. No wind clawing at the walls. No snow hissing against the roof. Just a deep, peaceful quiet that felt earned. For a moment, he didn't move. He lay there on the floor, near the fire ring, staring up at the beams he'd reinforced with his own hands, listening to the steady breathing around him. The family slept wherever they had fallen. The man slumped against the wall. The woman curled protectively around her children. The smallest boy was wrapped in every blanket Ethan owned, his chest rising and falling in soft, reassuring rhythm. Alive. That single word filled the room. Ethan pushed himself up slowly, his joints stiff, muscles sore in a way that felt almost satisfying. He added a piece of wood to the fire and watched the flames take hold. Warmth spread, cautious but real. Outside, daylight crept back into the world. The snow had reshaped everything. Drifts stood tall and smooth, turning the prairie into something almost gentle-looking. Tracks led nowhere. The road was completely gone. If anyone was coming, it wouldn't be soon. The woman woke first. She startled when she saw Ethan standing nearby, then relaxed as memory returned. Her shoulders sagged, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes shining. "He's warm," she whispered. "I can feel it." Ethan nodded. "He'll be tired today, but he's okay." Her knees buckled slightly, finally overcome with relief. Ethan instinctively reached out, watching her carefully as she steadied herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't even know your name." "Ethan," he replied. "I'm Laura," she answered. "This is my husband, Mark, and our kids, Ben and Owen." At the sound of his name, Mark stirred, blinking awake. When he realized where he was and what had happened, his expression broke wide open in a way Ethan had never seen on an adult's face. Gratitude, fear, something close to awe. "You saved our son," Mark said quietly. Ethan shook his head. The house did. Mark looked around, really taking in the patched walls, the uneven beams, the rough floor, the place that shouldn't have been standing at all. "Then you saved the house," he said. They spent the rest of the morning slowly and carefully. Laura insisted on making food with what little they had left. It wasn't much, soup thinned with water, bread torn into small pieces to make it last. But they ate like people who understood exactly how close they had come to losing everything. Ben, the older boy, hovered near Ethan, his eyes wide with curiosity. "You live here?" Ben asked finally. Ethan nodded. "By yourself?" "Yeah, when?" Ben frowned, processing. "You're not scared?" Ethan thought about the cold nights, the roof threatening to cave in, the storm trying to tear everything apart. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I'm more scared of leaving." That answer seemed to satisfy Ben. They stayed for 2 days. The road needed time to clear, and Mark's truck, half buried in snow, needed digging out and repairs. Mark worked alongside Ethan, shoveling, hauling, and clearing ice until their shoulders burned. Laura kept the fire going, kept Owen warm, kept the small space feeling oddly full. Something shifted during those days. Not in a big, dramatic way, but quietly. Laughter appeared, tentative at first, then easier. Ben told stories. Laura hummed as she worked. Mark shared bits of their life. How they'd been headed west for a fresh start, but it had never come easy. At night, they sat around the fire, not talking about plans or dreams, just about surviving. On the second night, after the kids had fallen asleep, Mark cleared his throat. "We don't have much," he said, "but we want to help. Pay you back." Ethan stared into the fire. "You don't owe me anything." Laura reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "We saved this for emergencies." Ethan shook his head immediately. "No." Mark studied him, then asked, "Then what do you need?" The question caught Ethan off guard. He thought about money, about supplies, about all the things the house still needed. Then he thought about how the place had felt before they arrived. Quiet, empty, safe, but lonely. "Tell people," Ethan said slowly. "Tell them this house works, that it's not cursed, that it can hold." Mark smiled. "We can do that." When the family finally left, hugging Ethan goodbye like he belonged to them now, the house felt different, changed, not emptier. Word traveled faster than Ethan expected. Within a week, people started stopping by, not to stare, not to whisper, but to offer small things. A bundle of firewood left by the door. A sack of potatoes dropped off without comment. Someone fixed a section of fence down the road and stayed to chat. Ray Collins came by again, this time with no pretense. "Heard about Christmas," he said, leaning against his truck. "Heard you saved a kid." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I just did what anyone would." Ray snorted. "That's what people say when they know it's not true." Ray walked around the house slowly, nodding to himself. "Town's calling it the lighthouse now because of the lamp you keep on." Ethan blinked. "I'll just leave it lit so I can see." Ray smiled faintly. "Sure you do." Ray unloaded a crate from his truck. "Windows," he said. "Used, still good." Ethan stared, speechless. "I don't," Ray interrupted. "You've earned them." As winter stretched on, the house became a quiet point of gravity. People didn't gather there. It wasn't social. It wasn't comfortable enough for that. But everyone knew it was there, a place that held. Ethan worked harder than ever, not just for himself. Ethan sealed drafts, reinforced beams, built a proper door that closed tightly, and hung the windows Ray had given him. He marveled at how different the world looked through glass instead of open holes. One night, as snow drifted lazily down outside, Ethan stood in the center of the room, taking in his work. This place had nearly killed him. Now, it had saved someone else. Something settled deep in his chest, steady, unshakable. The house wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to the idea that no one should freeze if there was light to guide them. And as long as Ethan lived here, that light wouldn't go out. By January, winter no longer felt like an emergency. It still hurt, still demanded respect, but it didn't feel like it was trying to kill him every single night. That shift mattered. The house stood firm now. Not perfect, never perfect, but solid in the ways that mattered. The roof held. The windows blocked most of the wind. The door shut with a weighty finality that made Ethan breathe easier every time he heard it. The cold still crept in, but no longer owned the house. Ethan's days fell into a routine of sorts. He woke early, fed the fire, checked the walls and roof, then ventured into town when the weather allowed. Word had spread quietly, without ceremony. If someone needed a shed repaired, a porch reinforced, or a fence rebuilt after the snow, Ethan's name came up. Not loudly, but often. "You should ask the kid," people would say. "The one with the $5 house." At first, Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't used to being asked for anything except to leave. He accepted jobs cautiously, expecting the catch that never came. Payment ranged from a few dollars to a hot meal, sometimes just materials he could use back home. Every bit of it mattered. Ray Collins became a regular presence, not hovering, but there. He taught Ethan how to measure properly, square corners, and read the grain of wood before cutting. He never called it teaching. He just corrected mistakes and explained why. "Wood tells you what wants to do," Ray said once, watching Ethan plan a board. "Your job is to listen." Ethan listened. He learned quickly. The town learned something too. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't a lucky storm or one brave night. The boy with the broken house was building things that lasted. More importantly, he showed up every time. But doubt hadn't vanished entirely. One afternoon, Carl Jennings, a man with hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, came by. He owned a small property a few miles out and had heard about Ethan through neighbors. "I don't need anything fancy," Carl grumbled. "Just need my barn door fixed. It's been sticking for years." Ethan nodded. "I can take a look." Carl crossed his arms, skeptical, watching as Ethan worked. When Ethan finished, the door swung open smoothly, closing tight without catching. Carl stared at it for a long moment, then reached into his pocket, pulling out more money than Ethan had asked for. "For your time," he said. Ethan hesitated, but took the money. "Thank you." Carl paused at his truck, not looking back. "You know," he said, "most folks twice your age don't work like that." Ethan stood there after Carl left, holding the money, feeling something warm spread through his chest. Not pride, validation. The house changed again during those weeks. Ethan added shelves, built a simple table, and reinforced the floor so it no longer shifted underfoot. Each improvement made the place feel less temporary, less like something he could lose at any moment. One evening, as he hammered in the last nail on a new section of wall, a knock came at the door. He froze. The sound of a knock still did that to him. When he opened it, he found Ray standing there, with a woman in a thick coat and a boy about Ethan's age beside her. "This is Linda Harper," Ray said, "and her son Noah." Linda smiled nervously. "I heard you might be able to help. Our furnace went out, and repair crews are backed up for days. The house is already dropping below safe temperatures." "I could try," Ethan said. They worked by lantern light in Linda's basement, fingers numb, breath visible. Ethan remembered the cold creeping up the walls of his own house and worked quickly, carefully. When the furnace finally kicked back on, warm air flooded the space. Linda covered her mouth, her eyes shining. "You have no idea what this means." Ethan did. Word spread even further after that. People stopped calling him the kid and started using his name. Ethan Walker, the boy who fixed things, the boy who didn't quit. Late one afternoon, as winter began to loosen its grip just slightly, Ray sat at Ethan's table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. "You ever think about the future?" Ray asked casually. Ethan shrugged. "I think about the house." Ray nodded. "Fair, but you've got something here. Skill, reputation. Folks trust you." Ethan stared at the tabletop, tracing a groove in the wood. Trust still felt strange to him. Ray cleared his throat. "The town council's been talking. They need someone reliable for maintenance work. Someone who won't disappear. I mentioned your name." Ethan's head snapped up. "I'm 14. Ray smiled. "You work like you're 40. Silence hung between them. "I'm not saying now," Ray added. "I'm saying soon." That night, Ethan lay awake, listening to the house settle, and let himself imagine something new. Not just survival, but stability. He thought about the people he'd helped, the doors that now closed properly, the warmth restored to places that had been slipping toward cold. The house, once a refuge, had gone from a hiding place to a landmark, a point of reference. As February bled into March, the snow began to soften. Drips echoed from the eaves during the warmest parts of the day. The world didn't feel so sharp anymore. One evening, Ethan stood outside, watching the sky fade into soft blues and grays. The lamp at his window glowed behind him, steady, and warm. A man walking down the road tipped his hat as he passed. Ethan nodded back. It was a small moment, but it carried weight. The boy had been kicked out with nothing but a backpack, and $5 wasn't invisible anymore. People saw him now, and more importantly, they believed in him. For the first time, Ethan began to believe in himself, too. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, hesitant signs. The first drip of melting snow from the roof, the softening of the ground beneath his boots, the way the wind lost its sharp edge and began to feel almost kind. Winter loosened its grip slowly, as if it didn't trust that the land or the boy was ready yet. Ethan noticed every change. One morning he stood outside, watching sunlight hit the patchboards of the house, and realized something quietly astonishing. He had made it through not just the winter, but through the fear, through the doubt, through the long nights when quitting would have been easier than staying. The $5 house still looked rough from the outside. The boards didn't match. The roof bore scars from storms that had tried to tear it apart, but it stood straight, solid, unapologetic. Like him, people came by more often now. Not out of curiosity, not out of pity, but because this place had become a marker. If you passed the old road at dusk, you knew where you were by the warm glow spilling from Ethan's window. "That's the lighthouse," folks would say. "You're almost there." Ethan kept the lamp on every night, not because he needed it, but because someone else might. One afternoon, Ray Collins stopped by with paperwork tucked under his arm. He sat on the table carefully, deliberately. "You're officially listed now," Ray said. "Independent maintenance work. Town approved." Ethan stared at the paper, his name printed in black and white. "I'm still a kid," he said quietly. Ray smiled. "You were. Now you're something else." The work didn't overwhelm him. It grounded him. Repairs, builds, teaching younger kids how to measure, how to use tools safely. He never charged for lessons. He remembered too well what it felt like to be handed nothing and told to figure out alone. One evening, as the sun dipped low, a familiar truck pulled up. Mark and Laura, the same family from the storm, stepped out. Their boys jumped out first, laughing, running straight toward the house like it was a place they belonged. "We wanted you to see this," Laura said, handing Ethan a folded newspaper. The headline read, "Local boy turns abandoned house into winter refuge." Ethan felt his face flush. "I didn't," he began, but Mark interrupted. "You did. You opened a door. That matters." They stayed for dinner. Laughter filled the house in a way that still surprised Ethan when it happened. Before they left, Ben, the older boy, lingered behind. "I want to build things like you," Ben said. Ethan smiled. "Then start fixing what's broken." Years later, long after Ethan outgrew the jacket he'd worn that first winter, long after the house received a proper addition and a fresh coat of paint, people would still talk about that winter. They'd talk about the storms, about the night a light appeared where there hadn't been one before, about a boy who could have disappeared quietly but didn't. Ethan Walker grew up in that house. He built more around it: a workshop, a porch, a place where neighbors gathered when the weather turned bad or life got heavy. He never locked the door during winter storms, never turned the light off. When asked why, he always answered the same way: "Because I know what it's like to be out there." Sometimes, visitors would tour the property and say it was a nice story, inspiring, heartwarming, and some would walk away unchanged. But others, some would pause, look at the house, really look at it, and they'd understand. They'd see that it wasn't about money or luck or even skill. It was about a choice. The choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. The choice to build instead of break. The choice to keep a light on, not for yourself, but for anyone who might need it. So here's the question for you. If you were Ethan, 14 years old, alone with $5 and nowhere to go, what would you have done? Would you have walked away from the broken place? Or would you have stayed and tried to turn it into something more? And maybe the real question is this: is there a $5 house in your own life, something broken, forgotten, or dismissed that still deserves a chance? If this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel something real, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about resilience, kindness, and the quiet strength it takes to keep going when no one expects you to. Because sometimes The smallest light can guide someone through the darkest winter.